Well, good evening all. Thank you for coming. Tonight's lecture will be aimed very specifically at those born under Sagittarius. But if you don't fall into that category, don't worry, because it would have been identical had you been Capricorn or Cancer or anything else. An amazing number of people seem to believe that astrology has got something to offer them. Around a quarter of people in Anglo-American countries believe in astrology, women a bit more than men. Here are Gallup poll results for America, Canada in the middle, and the UK on the right, with the females in the pink and the males in that rather dirty bluey blacky colour there. And you can see that in all of those countries the female following exceeds that of the men. It's your homework to try and figure out why. I hesitate to offer an opinion. I could refer you to my colleague Professor Henry Higgins, if you like, but I could get myself into terrible trouble if I was to put up any hypotheses about that. Also, people high on neuroticism and questionnaires are more likely to actually read their horoscope for guidance, as though their self-esteem deficiency is such that they need a bit of extra help. Belief in astrology declined between 2000 and 2005, according to the polling data. We've only got as far as 2005 here. But it does seem to be increasing specifically now, these days, amongst young people in particular. You might say that there is a new age of astrological beliefs. Something like 60% of young adults in the United States now believe in astrology, according to the National Science Foundation, while traditional religions, at least in Christian countries, are fading in the opposite direction, in young people in particular. And we have probably reached the point already where more young people believe in astrology than traditional religious beliefs. Now, you're familiar with the sun signs that I was joking about earlier. Pictorially arranged there with Pisces is the first of the 12. They don't correspond to our months exactly, but they overlap enormously. Now, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that the sun signs differ from one another in terms of personality. Natal charts, sun signs do not correlate significantly with personality as measured by the sorts of tests that psychologists like myself use. And it's also been established that people who are born under exactly the same planetary alignments have no similarity in personality as measured by the modern techniques of self-report. It is known that people who know what their sun sign is and know what traits are normally ascribed to it tend to think that their horoscope is more accurate. And other research has shown that their self-concept has actually been tilted in the direction of what it ought to be, according to traditional astrology. So that people who are born in December, if they know that Capricorn people are supposed to be practical and ambitious, they will tend to see that in themselves. People tend to believe in the connection between sun signs and personality more if their assumed traits are favourable. might be no great surprise to you. And if people who initially declare themselves skeptical about the value of horoscopes and astrology are given favourable feedback, supposedly based on it, then their opinion of astrology becomes more positive. The BARNUM effect is well recognized in personality questionnaire psychology. It was named after P.T. Barnum, the circus manager in America, who is credited with saying there's one born every minute, by which he meant a sucker. I think he even introduced that word. And it is the means by which astrologers, fortune tellers, and all kinds of charlatans persuade people that they have special insight into their personality. They feed them statements which apply to everybody or which they would like to apply to them. Statements like, to others you appear self-confident, but inside you feel some degree of anxiety or uncertainty. You are an extremely creative person with a great sense of humour, but other people don't necessarily always appreciate your talents. Everybody puts their hand up to these statements, and these are mercilessly exploited by the writers of horoscopes. The more ambiguous the description, the more vague and the more flattering the statement is, the more people will accept it as being a valid description of themselves. In the 1950s, a French psychologist called Michel Gauquelin claimed that he had discovered an actual empirical relationship between the position of the planets at one's birth and the kind of career that you would be cut out to follow. What he did was look through who's who type books, records of famous sports people and military leaders, eminent ones mostly, going back through several centuries, constructed an enormous sample, and he discovered this relationship, which was, for example, that eminent sportsmen were more likely to be born when Mars was just appearing above the horizon, and again when it was just past the culmination point, just over the zenith. And he said that this was a statistically significant relationship and that it was supportive of traditional astrology. He went on to show that Jupiter showed the same relationship to professional actors. Famous actors were more likely to be born with Jupiter rising or going over the top. And in the case of scientists, Saturn was the significant planet. Now, of course, he also noted that it seemed to apply only to natural births, not those that were induced, which he took that to mean that what's important was that it was your natural birth time that was the significant factor, not one that was induced by the medical experts around. This effect, called the Mars effect, even though it applies to other planets and other occupations, various people have tried to replicate that over the years, and as time goes by, the effect seems to be fading. Early replications showed these effects in smaller proportion. The most recent ones, it seems to have evaporated. But that said, when Gauquelin first published his results in this field, it was exciting to the astrologers who thought, here at last is scientific vindication of our theories. And the scientists were just plain puzzled because they couldn't immediately see that there was anything wrong with it. They checked the data and so on, and because Gauquelin, to his credit, had made the data available and they checked it, and it seemed that he had found something real. But then along came an Australian psychologist, actually of Scottish origin, but he's been living in Australia for a long time, called Geoffrey Dean. And he showed that the Mars effect, and indeed all the other Gogolin planetary effects, could be accounted for by two things. One was the self-attribution effect. That is a tendency that if the stars say you ought to be a great military leader, then you are more likely to point yourself in that direction. And the other effect he found was that the parents were diddling the birth times. Apparently it was up to the parents to report what time and date their child was born, and that was going into the records that Gogolin had access to. And what he found was that the parents tended to avoid midnight, because that was the witching hour, and they would tilt it one side or the other according to what was most propitious, or auspicious, the better date and time to be born. Christian feasts, the full moon, and lucky days, that's the 1st of the month, the 3rd of the month, and the 7th of the month, were being favoured in terms of registered birth times, whereas witches' sabbats, times of the new moon, and the unlucky days, the 9th, the 13th, and the last day of the month, were being significantly avoided. Now, how did the parents even know that? We wouldn't expect parents today to know when the witches' sabbats were and so on, but apparently this information was all available in almanacs that were widely used and consulted in the day, rather like our pocket diaries, still actually tell you what the phase of the moon is and what the feast of St. Stephen or something falls on. They do have religious holidays and data about the position of the moon and the sun. Now, in those days, the almanacs were very important to people. They would, the farmers would plant their field according to the position of the moon and so on, so they had to know about it. And Gogolin's data went back 2 or 3 centuries when these almanacs were the usual means of people organising their lives. And hence it's not surprising that the induced births didn't come out because, of course, the hospital authorities would register the time of the birth if they'd induced it. It wouldn't be left to the parents to pop down to the registry and give it. And it also accounts for the fact that the effects have faded away when people come to look for it today. Now, research on people who believe in astrology and, in fact, believe in paranormal phenomena in general, as opposed to those that don't, reveals certain personality differences. They're commonly described as sheep versus goats in the psychological literature. The sheep being the believers, the goats are the skeptics. And the research shows that sheep tend to be higher in a personality trait called openness to experience. They're more open to weird ideas and unusual ways of thinking. They tend to be lower in conscientiousness, which is another of the big 5 personality dimensions, than goats. And interestingly, it is the exact reverse for traditionally religious people, who tend to be more conscientious than the norm and less open to experience. The research also shows that the believers, the sheep, are inclined to various schizotypal, schizoid tendencies. They are more likely to use recreational drugs, and hence you could summarize that as by saying that they are New Age tendencies. A researcher called Thalborn describes paranormal belief as a form of transliminality, is his word. by which he is talking about the blurring of fantasy between, the blurring of the boundary between fantasy and reality, and a tendency to seek and enjoy altered states of consciousness, even if they are obtained by recreational drugs, of course. The research of others, Irwin and company, shows that paranormal beliefs are generally associated with the same sort of reasoning biases that underlie psychotic delusions. There is an error in thinking whereby thoughts become motivated rather than hard, cold logic. And a Canadian researcher called Michael Persinger has been doing work to suggest that certain people have very sensitive temporal lobes. That's the side of your head with some very important emotional areas lying just underneath. He describes it as electrosensitivity, in that in the laboratory, if you electrically stimulated that part of the brain, people are more likely to report anomalous experiences, paranormal experiences, out-of-body experiences, what do you call them, sleep paralysis, bizarre dreams, and so on. And Persinger reckons that such people are also more susceptible to mini seizures of a semi-epileptic nature, particularly emanating from the amygdala and the hippocampus, two parts of the limbic system lying underneath the temporal lobes. So people who believe in astrology or paranormal beliefs in general tend to fit a particular kind of description. The word lunacy, of course, refers to the idea that crazy behavior is in some way connected with phases of the moon. And 43% of people believe that the full moon causes erratic behavior. An even higher number of mental health professionals, emergency workers, people have to deal with extraordinary kinds of behavior, will, as many as 80% of them say, yes, the moon does make people a little bit crazy. But the scientific evidence doesn't really back this up. There was a meta-analysis done of 37 independent studies of the relationship between the moon phases for the full moon and things like psychiatric admissions, crisis calls, accident rates, murder rates, suicide rates by these researchers, admittedly a few years ago now. But they found no consistent effects of the moon phases. At best, there was about a 1% effect, which of course would be too small for any casual observer to notice. Likewise, there was a review of 20 separate studies on the relationship between suicide and moon phases, again found no significant effects. Now, we do still get odd positive results being reported in the scientific literature, for example, one just this year. But the effect sizes tend to be extremely small. Again, seldom accounting for more than about 1% of variance, which is not so anybody would notice. It's widely supposed that wolves become highly activated at full moon, and particularly aggressive and dangerous. Now, wolves don't actually bay at the moon, despite that graphic. They tilt their head upwards because they can make a better noise that way. But in fact, wolves hunt less at the full moon because the prey tends to conceal itself more, and the baying at the moon is more to do with long-distance communication. For a variety of reasons, mating, calling a mate, it's a kind of singing as far as wolves are concerned. It's as close as wolves get to singing, but it may carry other messages to rival males. It will be a territorial consolidation, like I am here, the rest of you can take off. But it is not the prelude to hunting very ferociously. Now, of course, some people have been interested in the possibility of if wolves get bitey at the full moon, maybe ordinary dogs do as well. And there was one study at the emergency department of the Bradford Infirmary that the data is here, in which patients being admitted with dog bites seemed to come in more at the full moon, tended to peak at the full moon. And that became a very popular study, and I don't know that there's anything wrong with it. It could be genuine data. All I can say is that an Australian study tried to do exactly the same thing with an equally impressive sample and failed to find anything at all. If anything, there were fewer dog bites at the full moon than at other times. So quite why there is a difference there between those two studies, I can't tell you, but it does make you a little bit suspicious of the original report from Bradford. More replications required, I would say. Now, lycanthropy is a rare clinical condition in which a person imagines that they are turning into a wolf at the full moon or some other kind of an animal, or they behave as though they are. And of course, it will have its roots in the werewolf legends that abounded across Europe through the Middle Ages. At one stage, it was actually illegal not to believe in werewolves. And more recently, we've got horror movies, and the book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was extremely popular, still is. Now, this may appear as a form of multiple personality disorder, is one way of classifying it. Other people say that it's a simple empowerment fantasy, that people who think if they're a wolf, they're a pretty terrifying and masculine kind of a beast that everybody ought to respect duly. Or it could just be a psychotic delusion. There are several possibilities people have diagnosed in different ways. There is a psychoanalytic theory that what it is projecting one's own sexual and aggressive instincts onto an animal. So it's not me, it's a wolf kind of thing that's feeling these brutish instincts. Or you might think that it's just a very convenient excuse for letting out the animal in oneself that no doubt resides there. There was at least one case found that was connected with organic damage to the proprioceptive areas of the brain, those which are concerned with knowing where your body is and how it is shaping. But one thing's for sure, that if a person really believes that they have some wolf in them, then there's likely to be some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and they will run around acting like a wolf. Why do so many people believe in the power of the moon to affect behavior? Well, one thing seems to be observation of the effects of gravity on the tides, which is quite striking. Everybody's seen it. Tides rise and fall twice a day. And they think, well, if the moon is going to pull the seas around to that extent, and we are 80% water, which is often cited, may be true, then surely we are going to be affected by the moon's gravity as well. Only problem is that other scientists have calculated, I don't know how, that the gravitational effects on the water on the body are minuscule. And anyway, the whole thing collapses when you realize that the gravitational pull of the moon is constant, regardless of whether it's a full moon or a new moon. Actually, full moon and a new moon are both likely to pull a bit more than the phases in between, because then you have the sun and the moon in alignment so that there is summation between their gravity. Spring tides versus neap tides. Of course, the idea of the effects of the moon are reinforced by all the myths and horror stories, movies and so on that we've had throughout history. There is selective recall as well. If something extraordinary happens and there's a full moon up there, we tend to connect the two. Well, it happened because there was a full moon. But if something extraordinary happens, somebody commits suicide or has a car accident or something, and there is not a full moon apparent, nobody connects that. It was because there wasn't a full moon. Our thinking doesn't tend to go that way. It's easier to perceive the link with the moon if it is full. Now, it is true that moonlight is romantic, perhaps illustrated in this painting here, which might have been the cover of a Mills and Boon novel, for all I know. The illumination is very subtle, mysterious. People look sort of airbrushed, so the blemishes in their complexion don't show. And it's optimal for being mischievous, because you can just see enough that you don't trip over tree roots, but you also have a feeling of anonymity and concealment, so you can get up to no good. And this is probably the basis of the full moon parties that you may have heard about in Thailand. Now, of course, the moon cycles roughly a month, and so do women. So that at the very least, the moon phases are a metaphor for the female cycle. But that is sheer coincidence, because, of course, other primates don't cycle on a monthly basis. However, there is some suggestive research showing that women who have a stable 30-day cycle will sometimes lock it onto moon phases, menstruating mainly when the moon turns full. And this research also showed that those women were slightly more fertile than those that had erratic, irregular cycles that couldn't lock onto moon phases. So there is, unfortunately, again, somebody else did that study and couldn't find the same effect. So we're left thinking that it's not very persuasive data. There is a theory that beliefs about lunacy and full moons might have come about because historically the full moon would have disrupted people's sleep. This is before the advent of electric lights in the modern world. There might have been a few people that would have manic or epileptic episodes that were precipitated by the extra light of the full moon interrupting their sleep pattern. And of course, we wouldn't find that today because artificial lighting has obscured the difference between full moon light and new moon light. Now, that sounds like an interesting idea which would blame the moonlight, not the gravity, and that makes a great deal more sense because moonlight is a real variable. But there was a study in Switzerland that showed that even if you put people into a sealed sleep lab where they cannot see the moon phases, the full moon still seems to disrupt their sleep, and this time measured properly with EEG patterns and showing a shorter phase of deep sleep. Melatonin production, which would normally be produced in greater quantities when it's dark, as well as self-report. So they had some physiological measures. And these authors reckon that is evidence of an ancient lunar cycle or clock in our brain, determining that is connected with moon phases. There's an echo of that in human behavior, even when we can't see the moon. Whereas other people have pointed out, well, perhaps some of these subjects actually knew what the phases of the moon were because they're still in pocket diaries. You'd have to eliminate that, and there's no mention of that in this in the study. At last, we have some real convincing effects, which are the season of birth effects on health and behavior. They are persuasively documented. Humans, of course, are fairly unusual in breeding fairly evenly across the year. Most non-human animals have a clear seasonal pattern of reproduction. But that's pretty much obscured, particularly in a modern industrial society where we control heat and light. Now, it seems like there is a peak of conception in April and perhaps a smaller one in November in the European and the United States latitude countries. And the reason for that seems to be that 12 degrees centigrade in the morning in that area is about the optimal temperature for conception and whatever leads to conception. I wouldn't know about that. Plus the fact that in April and November you've got roughly equal periods of light and dark near to the equinoxes. Which might also have something to do with it because, of course, in our ancestral evolutionary history, the tropics, you do have exactly 12 hours dark and 12 hours light. Now, the best time to be born seems to be autumn. In fact, you're likely to live 160 days longer than if you were born in spring. What's that, about 4 or 5 months? And of course, it's the reverse in the southern hemisphere, where you better be born in the autumn. Another study showed that people who make it to the age of 100, centenarians, were more often born in September and November, whereas the control group of their siblings that didn't make it to 100 were more often born in March, the spring again. So spring, of course, corresponds to a winter of fetal development where there might be certain forms of deprivation. Winter birth has been linked to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, creativity, and left-handedness. Don't know what the theme is there exactly, but there is one, I believe. Schizophrenia, about 10% more common in winter births compared to summer births. That's not a lot. Most schizophrenics are not, of course, born in winter. It's a significant effect, but not a striking one, so that if you were born in winter, it doesn't mean you're totally crazy by any means. And, of course, similar effects are found, actually, slightly dissimilar effects. Whereas certain disorders seem to be worse in winter births, the worst time seems to be the spring months. There are more things that tend to go wrong if you're born in March, April, May, perhaps, than in here. And unfortunately, this chart has not reversed the scoring for the Southern Hemisphere, so that schizophrenia in the Southern Hemisphere peaks in summer and early autumn, whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, as I said just a moment ago, it's winter, December and January. Another exception, perhaps asthma, is more likely to be summer into autumn birth. maybe something to do with allergens that are more common at that time of the year. What else here? Those are some of the more obvious. Oh yes, multiple sclerosis. That's northern hemisphere early summer and southern hemisphere late autumn, early winter. So where you do see a reversal of the pattern between the northern and southern hemisphere, you can be pretty sure that the season of birth is the critical factor. Now, what are some of the reasons why season of birth might have an impact? One, of course, is that the mother has poorer nutrition in the winter, and there are more infectious diseases like influenza around. And in the winter running up to the spring birth. Vitamin D depends very largely on sunlight, which is deficient during the winter months, particularly in high latitudes rather than at the equator. And there's very good evidence that this is one of the effects on fetal development that results in health problems. Multiple sclerosis is one, where in Switzerland, the likelihood that you will get MS depends upon the altitude at which you are born, with the higher altitudes having greater sunlight and hence lower levels of MS. And in Norway, apparently, whether or not you get MS depends upon whether you are born close to the coast, where there are plenty of fish to provide you with an alternative source of vitamin D, or whether you are born inland. Am I getting strange feedback effects now? Allergens, I've suggested, vary by season, with pollen being more common in spring and summer. There's a study with rats that shows that the light-dark cycle that is pertaining around the time of birth in the baby rat will permanently imprint the biological clock in such a way as to affect activity cycles for the rest of its life. Now, of course, humans are not rats, not all of them anyway, but nevertheless, there may be some residual of that in human beings. Somebody else suggested that maybe the type of mother that gives birth at different seasons might be relevant. Deprived mothers tend to give birth more often in the months with the worst outcomes. Mothers of low socioeconomic status, for example. There are more teenagers and unmarried mothers give birth in winter, apparently, and some researchers, such as these two, have suggested that it may be the type of the mother favouring particular seasons for birth that could be producing or reinforcing some of these results. And that little odd one, summer-born children do worse at school quite simply because they are younger than their classmates. That's a bit of the physiology that's likely to be important in biological clocks. Suprachiasmic nuclei are those where the input from the eyes crosses over in the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland back here produces melatonin, which is a hormone that controls a lot of biological clocks. By the light inhibiting its secretion. Alternatively, it gets turned on in the dark. The Dracula hormone, somebody dubbed it. Now here's a rather interesting study. Professional baseball players in the United States, particularly those that were the biggest hitters, in a very large sample, hundreds of professional players, showed distinct seasonality of birth. There were more born in November than you would expect by chance, and fewer in May. And this study found that lesbians showed the same pattern as the big hitting baseball players, and gay men showed the opposite. Now, in attempting to make sense out of this, Marzullo, the author, says, well, the 4th month of pregnancy is the time when male-female differentiation is at its height in utero, and this would be occurring at the summer solstice for the November births in the baseball players and the lesbians. Whereas it would be the midwinter solstice for the May births that show the lower relationship. And his suggestion is that sunlight perhaps suppresses melatonin in the mother at the 4th month of pregnancy, and this will unleash fetal testosterone, because there is feedback between melatonin and sex hormones, which would masculinize the fetus for the November birth and feminize it for a May birth. That's the theory, anyway. Yeah, and of course it would apply vice versa in winter. Sort of study that fascinating, but we look forward to the replication. Solar activity as mediated by sunspots cycles over a period of 11 years. Here's the 11-year cycle. We're just coming up to this point at the moment, which is a maximal point of solar activity. So you expect more solar flares to be making their way through space to Earth. We know that they can affect communications, satellite communications, for example, are particularly exposed. They're outside of the atmosphere, and but all communications are susceptible to interference from the sunspot cycle, which incidentally seems to be diminishing, and some people think that this is because the sun's polarity is about to flip north-south, and quite what that will do, we don't know. But apparently the polarity of the sun does flip from time to time, as indeed Earth's polarity has been known to do through history. Well, not recent history, archaeological history, or geological history. And there is that intermediate phase where where there is no obvious north and south pole, and that can complicate life enormously, apparently. It might even correspond to a major extinction event when it happens next on Earth. But it looks as though the sun is about to flip, and so we won't get this regular 11-year cycle. But so long as we do, there are theories that it is not just affecting communications, but also some aspects of human behavior and health, either through direct electrical effects on the brain, of the kind that Persinger is talking about, or through epigenetics, tweaking gene expression in such a way as to create mutations and alter behavior in quite radical ways, potentially. There are studies looking at that possibility right now. Most commonly cited are anxiety, depression, suicide as being implicated in connection with solar activity and sunspots, solar flares, and so on. But also things like temporal lobe seizures, hallucinations, UFO sightings, and every imaginable kind of paranormal phenomena. Alien abductions, out-of-body experiences, sleep paralysis, whatever, are supposed to be more common. The only problem is, as I say, that all of these studies look impressive. I think there's some Russian ones even showing a connection with serial killing and terrorist acts. So hard to know what to believe, especially since some of them don't even agree on whether it's high or low electromagnetic activity that is implicated. The other thing you have to realize is that electromagnetic activity comes not just from the sun, but from your television set and microwave cooker and all kinds of other possible sources. The laboratory of Michael Persinger is another place. Now, assuming that there is something in this effect, Earth's magnetic field being affected by solar activity, then a likely candidate for mediating it is something called a cryptochrome. That's a picture of it. Rather pretty, isn't it? And these are photoreceptor proteins that are of ancient evolutionary origin, particularly sensitive to blue light and ultraviolet light, I believe. They are responsible for turning the leaves of plants towards the sun, but they are also available in certain insects and some animals, particularly birds and turtles. They've been well established in. Now, not only are they contributors to the biological clocks, but they can sense magnetic fields and are used by some animals, obviously birds, to assist in long-range navigation across the surface of the Earth. And some people think that there are cryptochromes available in human beings as well, and that these might be mediating electromagnetic effects on our brain that can disturb our behavior and make us experience weird phenomena. If so, if they do work, it's probably through the pineal gland, melatonin perhaps. Other possibilities have been suggested are that the hypothalamic pituitary stress system could be involved in disturbances of consciousness, so that you're actually being literally upset, apart from being disoriented. And research in this area is currently in its infancy, but I would say it's not necessarily all nonsense. You have to look at it closely, and I'm not the best person to be able to judge its validity. I think it's a very interesting field and one to watch for the future. Going to give you a bit more time for discussion today because this is my last slide in which I summarize these effects. There's no evidence for planetary effects of any description on behavior, either connected with time of birth or otherwise. The moon's gravity has no apparent effect, and the phases of the moon, moonlight, has very little impact. It might have a very small significant effect which is barely detectable to the observer. The season of birth effects on health are real, no doubt about that, particularly for people who live some distance from the equator. The solar storms, geomagnetic activity and so on, might have subtle disruptive effects on our psychology, but the research is controversial still. Superstitious beliefs generally seem to stem from a logicality, even schizoid tendencies, that you might sort of summarize as a loose grip on reality, sometimes aided by a bit of ecstasy or cocaine. Now, you're probably familiar with the heartthrob astronomer come pop singer, Professor Brian Cox. In his his wonderful series about the wonders of the solar system, I think it was called, he described astrology as a load of rubbish. And of course, there were howls of protest from professional astrologers complaining that this was unbalanced, that we were not getting an astrologer to put the opposite point of view, and that Professor Cox ought to issue an apology. So Cox came back and said, I am terribly sorry. What I should have said was that this New Age trivia is actually a threat to civilization, or words to that effect. And incidentally, he is echoing Patrick Moore, his predecessor as a television astronomer, who said very similar things. Now, is he overreacting a bit? That is, isn't it all just harmless fun, reading your horoscope, like reading the fortunes in Chinese cookies? And why worry about it? Well, it could potentially be dangerous, especially when the person who is consulting the horoscope has got his finger on the nuclear button, as was the case when Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. Because according to his chief of staff, Donald Reagan, Reagan would never make any major decision without, first of all, having his wife Nancy go to an astrologer called Joan Quigley to get the prognostications as to whether the planets were in a favorable alignment or something before he went ahead and invaded Iraq or whatever. Not that he did that, but whatever decisions Reagan had to make. So it could potentially be terribly dangerous. You might think that that's all a little bit scary. So left a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.